Hello and welcome to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Jeanette Brown, and I'm thrilled to have you. We are at a point in the admissions season right now where rounds 3 and sometimes 4 are wrapping up, and that means that people are hearing their final decisions and making their choices about where to go in the fall. These folks face a tough choice. In some cases, they've been accepted to a safety school that they will consider going. In other cases, they have to think about telling their network and their family that they didn't get into the school that they wanted this year and they're going to try again next year. And we hope that the vast majority of our listeners are not in this boat, but it's not uncommon at all. So speaking to those who find themselves in exactly this place, we have a lot of great guidance for how you can decide whether reapplying is right for you, and if so, how you can make the very most out of the reapplication process and be successful. We're excited for those folks, but we also realize that there are some out there listening now who did not get into their preferred programs, and they are facing the decision of whether perhaps to go to a safety school or whether to reapply next year. And we hope this isn't applicable to a ton of you, but we know it's an important discussion to be having for those of you who are facing this decision, and we're going to do that today. I am grateful to have with me here Clear Admit co-founder Graham Richmond, and he is going to help talk through the reapplication process and how to decide if it's right for you. Welcome, Graham.
Thanks, Jeanette. I should mention Jeanette and I are in the same room today, which rarely happens, so it's a pleasure to do this in person. Today we're going to talk about reapplying to MBA programs. And before we start, I have a confession, Jeanette, that I wanted to just get off my chest as we start this podcast. And that is to say that I was rejected from business school when I first applied. And I know some folks who listen regularly know that I ultimately went to Wharton, but it was a kind of a long road to get there. I applied to Harvard, Wharton, a whole bunch of schools, Tuck, Columbia, NYU, a whole bunch of top schools in my first application season. And I was certain that I was headed off to business school. And then, despite a couple of wait lists and an admission to a kind of a safety school, I ended up, not going that first year because I didn't get into any of the schools that I really wanted to get into. So I'm happy to kind of share some personal, experience with the reapplication process, as well as some of our, we have a lot of really good general advice that we can tackle today. Where do you want to start?
Well, wow, I hadn't known that before today. And while I am sorry that it wasn't one season and done, I'm thrilled that you can really, truly provide some personal experiences and advice that will really apply. So what did you do when you found out that you hadn't gotten into your preferred programs? And you mentioned a safety school. How did you make the decision to reapply rather than pursue the safety school?
Yeah, so I made a number of, I guess, what you could call rookie mistakes. And I think I was fortunate to have a lot of people around me who set me on the right path after rejection from the top schools that I had considered. And so essentially, I did the first mistake I made was I applied to a school that I had no intention of ever attending, and that was my safety school. And the danger with applying to a school that you don't really want to go to or that you're not excited about is that when you get in and that's the only school you've gotten into, it's not just pressure from within where you're like, gosh, I should go. This is where I got in. But you get a lot of pressure from friends or family members. So I remember getting some pressure from colleagues and family members saying, hey, look, you didn't make it at Wharton or Harvard, but you got into this school. Why don't you just go there? In most cases, these were folks who had less of an understanding of kind of the MBA landscape and certainly weren't familiar with rankings and so they weren't necessarily giving me great advice. But I was fortunate enough to actually get a phone call from the director of admissions at Wharton. There was a message on my machine when I got home one day. This is now I'm dating myself, but yes, we had answering machines, and there was a message. And I remember when I got home and I heard the director of admissions' voice on the answering machine, I thought, they've made a mistake. I wasn't rejected. They're calling to apologize. But no, it was actually a phone call just saying, I think I'd interviewed with this person, and they were saying, gosh, sorry that, things didn't work out, but if you're interested, you can have a feedback session.
What a roller coaster of a ride in that phone call.
Yeah, I definitely remember my kind of spirits being raised and then dashed as soon as the message was, well, come round to campus or have a phone call with us, and we'll go over why we rejected you. With that said, that was probably one of the most important phone calls of my life, in the sense that it set me on the right path to reapply. And I think as we kind of talk through this, like, one of the things that you need to do as a reapplicant, first of all, if you've kind of been rejected everywhere, is like reevaluate. Like, you should probably think about not what your application strategy was, but like, do you still want the MBA? Like, I think that's the first sort of key step here, is to kind of just make sure that, like, okay, I'm going to reapply. This is for me. Like, I want the MBA still. And that was the case for me. Like, I knew that I wanted the MBA, and I wanted it from one of, there were a few schools that I wanted to, was really excited to go to. And so, yeah, I quickly learned that don't apply to somewhere that you wouldn't be happy to attend. And yeah, I kind of reaffirmed my interest in the degree before kind of setting out to reapply.
Now, I want to ask you to flesh out that a little bit more. By not applying to a school that you wouldn't want to attend, are you saying you shouldn't have safety schools?
No, I think you should always apply to a range of programs, but I made the mistake of I applied to a school that I kind of knew I would get into, but that I wasn't excited about attending. And so I went probably too low on the scale or something, where there probably were some schools in between the safety school that admitted me and the Harvard and Whartons that I applied to that I may have gotten into, and then that's probably where I would have gone in the end. But I had too much of a kind of range.
I think that's a helpful point to make. So, and how many people receive calls from a school saying you might want to think about reapplying?
It's actually pretty rare. Most times it comes in the form of, especially in this era, the form of an email, or even just in the rejection letter, a school may indicate that they provide feedback sessions to candidates. And this isn't all schools. I mean, there are a lot of schools that, it's sort of like you get the rejection letter and they don't want to hear from you. In fact, I understand. I mean, who wants to? It's always a difficult conversation. So even in the case of Wharton, for example, Wharton used to do feedback with any rejected candidate back when I was an applicant. And they no longer do it. They actually gradually, first they went down to kind of, well, we'll provide it to a select number, which was literally, they just had like a certain number of time slots. So like you had to schedule quickly, or else they ran out. They said, we'll talk to 100 people, and then after that, we're too busy. And then I believe they more recently moved to they just don't do feedback, where there are other schools that are quite kind of famous for providing good feedback and being very open about talking to people who don't make the cut. So if you are rejected and you're listening to this podcast, like, you need to find out, like, does your school provide a feedback session? That's another piece of advice, which kind of leads us to the second tip here, which is really around revisiting your applications and understanding like what may have led to the rejection in the first place.
Do you think you're more capable at that juncture of sort of reading your own application with a little more distance?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that that needs to happen. Is it's sort of like after the rejection settles in a week or two maybe, and you're kind of, the pain is starting to subside, or you're at least coming to grasp with your new reality. I think you have to dig back into the file and try to understand what it is that led to rejection. And I will say, like, I was not very good at this, and I was. When I went and had my feedback session at Wharton, it was pretty eye-opening. Like I had some inklings of things that I'd maybe done wrong or things that could have been stronger, but I think it's hard to be a judge. It's hard to judge your own work at times. And I mean, I could list could list off all the things I had done wrong. My GMAT score was a little low. My career goals were sort of foggy, and that was compounded by the fact that I was kind of a non-traditional candidate. So when you're a non-traditional candidate, I was working at a startup. You're kind of coming into the process, and the school's looking for every possible signal that, okay, this candidate knows what he wants. He's going to be, even though he's in this kind of non-traditional role now and, maybe didn't have a lot of undergraduate coursework that's relevant to an MBA, once he gets here, he's going to be well on his way because he has a clear plan. And I did not.
Because they're sort of already taking a chance on a non-traditional applicant. And so they want everything else to line up with this one's going to succeed.
Right. And so, I got some great advice. And I think, this is, maybe we'll jump around a little here, but I think the advice I got was, gosh, your GPA is okay, but you don't have a lot of quantitative coursework on the transcript, and your GMAT was a little below average and, quantitatively not a kind of home run. And so that kind of sets off this red flag for the admissions team. There was also, just general concern, as I said, about my career goals. So I got all this feedback about things I could do, and I actually devised a very kind of concrete plan of action. So, I took a test prep course to boost my GMAT score. I signed up for evening classes in calculus and accounting. And those were actually, I think people complain about this kind of thing. Like, is it going to be really hard? But it was like once a week classes at a local university, and it wasn't a ton of time. And, and I obviously worked hard and got A's in those classes. So I tried to kind of address some of the things. And then I worked a lot on thinking about why I wanted the MBA, what I would use it for, what my career plans were. Just did a better job of like trying to convince the admissions team that I was ready. Like I had the kind of academic aptitude to succeed in the program, but also, knew what I wanted out of it, and spent a lot of time in that extra. I had that extra year to apply, so I spent a lot of time talking to MBA students and alums and just gathering as much as I could about not only Wharton, where I reapplied and ultimately went, but to the other schools that I reapplied to as well. Because I had no idea. I mean, just because I had a feedback session at Wharton and, the admissions officer was really, kind and gave me great feedback, there was never a kind of comment like, if you do this, we will accept you. It was more like, this is why we rejected you. And if you were to reapply, you may want to try and address these things, right? So because there was no guarantee, I ended up reapplying everywhere, right? To all the schools that I wanted to attend. So, but I think it's important to revisit the applications and find out where your weaknesses are, or get someone that to look at your file and give you feedback. Because I think you spend so many hours writing the essays and preparing your profile that you kind of become blind to your own weaknesses. And we see it on the ClearAdmit website. Like I often see people who've indicated they've been rejected somewhere, and I take one look at their profile and like it's like there's like a flashing red light as to like why they didn't get in. But they're often leaving comments like, I don't know what happened here. I'm kind of scratching my head. And then luckily our community chimes in and says, well, it might be this, and so it's helpful to get outside feedback.
It's interesting. You've mentioned a range of great places to go to for that feedback. I wonder if and when this might actually be an occasion to consider an admissions consultant if you hadn't the first time around.
Yeah, I think it can be helpful. I mean, at minimum, getting what we call like a rejection analysis or a ding report from an admissions consultant can be useful. And at minimum, it allows you to maybe get a taste for what it would be like to work with someone as you apply to school. So going to an admissions consulting firm and paying a couple $100 to have them like look everything over and give you a report, A, may give you great feedback, but B, may actually connect you with the person that can then read your files as you reapply and give you helpful advice. I think that's certainly something to consider. Talking to colleagues getting feedback from admissions officers if the school provides it. I would say, mom and dad are not a good place to go.
Got some of the same blinders maybe, or different ones.
Yes. I mean, I remember I talked to my parents about my results, and they were kind of like, great, you got into school, that safety school, just off you go, kind of like.
My mom would have been indignant. They don't know what they're missing.
Right. Yes, there was some of that too. But it was like, but you got into one, and it,
Right.
it wasn't a bad school or anything.
Right.
So they were kind of like, just go. But I had this like dream of going to like, Harvard or Wharton or something. So I really was kind of grasping to that. And then once I got the feedback from Wharton that, look, you did A, B, and C wrong. If you did them right, like you'd be a better candidate. I was like, okay, I'm going after this. And yeah, I spent a lot of time on these different, kind of areas for improvement. And yeah, I mean, it was an interesting process. I was really grumpy. The other thing that I think is often not spoken about is a lot of people let friends know that they're applying. I mean, how can they not know? I mean, you're kind of absorbed in this process for many months. And I remember I felt like almost like a little embarrassed or humiliated, like in the sense that, my work colleagues who were all wonderful about it, I was like, oh, well, guys, I'm here for another year, and I had to go to my boss who had written recommendations for me and say, hey, it didn't work out. Can I stay? Because, he had been thinking, well, he'd written the letters. So he knew I was, in his mind, I was heading off to school in the fall. And then all of a sudden I wasn't.
Yeah, no, rejection is never pleasant. And here you've sort of staked a claim and said,
Right.
For a larger world to know, I am going for this.
Right.
Many of them have probably supported you in that effort. And now you have to turn around and say, in all caps, you didn't succeed.
Right. So it was definitely a humbling experience. But yeah, I think, as we look at kind of what reapplicants should do, I think just to kind of recap where we've gone so far, we've talked about, reevaluating your need for the MBA. We've talked about revisiting your applications and making sure that you work really hard to identify, like, okay, what may have resulted in the rejection. One thing that we haven't talked too much about, I guess, is like considering the results that you had. So I was kind of, even though I didn't get into Harvard or Wharton, I was waitlisted at Columbia and waitlisted at NYU. And so I was kind of like a little more positive than if I had just kind of run the table with rejections or something, right? So I felt like, okay, I'm close. And that was useful feedback. So like, whereas if I'd gotten in nowhere and maybe just waitlisted at my safety school, then I may have wanted to kind of recalibrate the schools to which I was like, what was my consideration set? And I think that's important for people to do, right? So if you've been rejected everywhere and there's, and you're not willing to move to make the changes or something, like if let's say you have like a 680 on the GMAT and, you applied to Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, MIT, and you got rejected at all of them, and you're not willing to like, improve your GMAT score, or you're like, oh, I've taken the test 3 times, it's not going up from here, then you might want to like recalibrate the range of schools to which you're applying. And that's not to say that you need to drop the top end, but I mean, you at minimum may want to
add
kind of
some more in the middle and lower end
yeah,
to round things out.
find some balance. And then, as we said earlier, like schedule a feedback session. I know Tuck does them. I believe Kellogg still does feedback.
Darden does them.
Yes, Darden. There are a handful of schools, and it does seem to change a little bit from year to year. The cynic in me says that when application volume is lower, schools seem more keen to provide feedback because maybe they have a little more time. But yeah, it's been fascinating to watch over the years. Some schools have just held like steadfast. Like I think of, Kellogg and some of these other schools that do feedback have done it for a while, the schools we just mentioned. But then schools like Wharton, they used to do it, now they don't. A school like Harvard has never provided feedback at least not to my knowledge. One thing we should draw the distinction as well is like some schools have kind of an open policy. Like if you're rejected, you reach out and we will provide feedback. Other schools seem to more selectively invite candidates for feedback. So You'll get a rejection letter that has a slightly different flavor if you are someone that they think could benefit from a year of additional experience or from making a few minor changes to your file. So they'll kind of more proactively like encourage feedback to try to get
Have
you
we
to.
seen any of those shared on Livewire? That would be interesting. If
There are some schools that where folks say, "Oh, did your rejection letter say this?" And sometimes it's a rousing chorus of yes, that's the generic letter, but then other times it's like, no, that's the letter they send to people who, they legitimately think could be a good applicant in a year's time. And sometimes that could just have to do with like work experience.
Right.
You applied with like 1 year or 2 years of work experience and they were looking for 3, or you hadn't, it depends on what the experience is, right? How much leadership or, management experience.
Different every application year, right? They might have gotten a lot of people from whatever industry you're coming from looking to go, and there just weren't that many spots, but they still saw you as a really strong candidate, et cetera. There are ways that you end up rejected, but are still a very viable candidate.
Right, exactly. So I think it is really important to consider like the data points that you have, including like, did the school communicate to you like we'd want you to reapply, or did they at least nudge? And I think, one thing we haven't talked about is when you do a feedback session, if a school provides it, it's actually a useful way to almost like build some rapport with someone in the admissions office who, if you play your cards right and you send a thank you and you kind of keep that person posted on your progress, they can become an advocate for you, such that when your file goes up to committee the next year, they'll remember, oh, I had a great conversation with Jeanette, and she, and then she emailed me and told me that, she retook the GMAT and that she got a promotion at work. And so like, if you're able to build some rapport and provide infrequent, but, some updates to the admissions officer, I think it can help the second time round.
And you're coming in with a relationship with these admissions folks that is a year longer than the people you were up against. And that can, if you develop that kind of rapport, result in them being more invested in you.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is because you maybe have less of a need to like visit every school when you're applying the second time, or you're just a bit more of a pro at some of this stuff, it can be, it can actually be quite helpful. You have more time to work on the essays or the other pieces of the process. And so one thing I will say, as some of you know, I also worked as an admissions officer at Wharton, and the one pet peeve I had is when the reapplicants would come in, and there are a lot of them every year. I mean, there are a lot of people who reapply to business school, is that some people reapply with literally the same application. And that's kind of like, they're like just sort of banging their head against the wall, and you're kind of like, why, that's almost offensive. Like, because I'm taking my time to read a file. We rejected the person the first year. What makes them think that the second year they don't really have to do anything to get in? So I think you have to be able to demonstrate like what's happened. Have you improved your test scores? Have you taken some outside classes to build what we call an alternative transcript? Have you gained additional responsibilities at work or in your community? Or have you thought more about your goals? I mean, there's so many things you can do. And some of them are not like, oh, I retook a test. Like some of them are a little more fuzzy and almost easier to address, right? But I think you've got to show like, oh, I've had all these conversations with graduates of the program, and I'm much more intimately familiar with exactly how school X is going to help me get through. So it's just one of those things where, you don't want to reapply to business school unless you're willing to do the work to sort of reposition or improve upon your candidacy the second time around.
That's making me think about two things. One is that every process is a learning curve. And so you need to show that you've learned something by virtue of going through it a second time. Right. The good news is that you should have learned something, and you should be able to come at it in a more strategic and nuanced way. But to not do that is going to pretty quickly raise some flags. And then I think that that advice of doing what you can to strengthen your candidacy is probably even more true if you have attended a waitlist review? I mean, I'm sorry,
Feedback.
a feedback session?
Yes, that's a great point. So if a school gives you feedback, like this happens all the time, believe it or not, a school will give someone feedback and then the person doesn't like do everything that they were, it's like, gee, this test score is low, or you need to take some courses, and then they reapply and they haven't done all of the things. They do like one of them. And it's sort of like, how bad do you want this?
Right.
If you really want it, like you'll do it. So the other thing I will say, and we probably should have started with this, is that reapplicants get into business school at a much higher rate than first timers. So I think we were talking the other day, Harvard, you said that
10% of the incoming Harvard class almost every year is reapplicants.
Right. And so even, I sometimes worry that there's this like rhetoric out there around if you don't get into Harvard or any top school, forget about it. They're not taking you the second time, and that is not true at all.
And though Harvard is not one of the schools that has historically offered feedback review, the admissions director there, both the current admissions director, Chad Losey, and his predecessor, Dee Leopold, were very forthcoming in their communications with reapplicants that they should reapply, and they would cite these figures that a full 10%. And they also highlight on their website the stories of reapplicants, the success stories of reapplicants.
Yeah, I think it's, and I guess another thing we should mention while we're kind of providing these little rays of sunshine into, what's kind of a sad thing, right? Getting rejected from business school is not a great thing, but reapplying, not only do reapplicants get in at a higher rate than sort of first timers, and not only are schools like Harvard and all the other top schools very willing to listen to the stories from reapplicants, but the reapplication process is often somewhat abbreviated for second timers. So you don't often you can kind of save some time. Like they have special requirements, and now it varies from school to school. There are schools that just say, okay, just do it all over again. But there are many schools that have like a special reapplicant essay in lieu of another essay, or that don't require the full set of recommendation letters, or they may keep your transcripts on file for an extra year. So there's some of these little tasks that you don't have to do the second time, which is quite helpful. And I think it really, I don't know why, but there is a lot of discussion out on the web about how, if you don't make the cut at HBS or Wharton or Stanford or any of these top schools, that, forget about it. There's nothing you can do to and in fact, by reapplying, you already have this big reject stamp on your file, and they don't want to like take you seriously, and that is not true. And I mean, this is coming from someone. So I took the advice that I got from Wharton. I reapplied to Columbia, Harvard, Wharton, a whole bunch of schools actually, because I was really worried. From the first time not getting in, I was like, I better, and I got in everywhere. Every single school admitted me. And they, there was never an issue. And even in my interviews for those schools, there was never like oh, well, we didn't take you the first time. Why should we take you now? There was nothing of that. It was really, I felt like I was being very fairly evaluated.
Does the cloak of the reapplicant follow you into business school, or can you just drop that?
No, I mean, you didn't even know I was a reapplicant until today. And so it wasn't something I talked about a lot, although I kind of feel for people who go through that process as a result. No, in fact, I know we talked about this with respect to waitlist folks as well. Like, is there some, kind of stigma, like to being a waitlister or a reapplicant? And the answer, in my experience, has been no. There's no. I don't even know who in my cohort at Wharton, for example, had reapplied or not, or who was waitlisted. Right. It just doesn't really come up. Once you're in, you're kind of in. The other thing that this is maybe more for the schools that listen to this podcast, but I personally found that getting feedback was not only really helpful, and I was really pleased that like at the time Wharton provided that, but it also, I felt like almost like a commitment to them. Because a lot of people ask me like, oh, you got into HBS and Wharton, and why did you go to Wharton versus HBS? And I had a lot of reasons for that. But one of them was like, I had this great feedback and they were so helpful. I felt like I had this like commitment, and there were other reasons. I was an art history major and I really wanted a kind of quantitatively rigorous MBA program. So there were many reasons, but it was just, I think that, as a candidate, there is this opportunity to build rapport with your feedback officer, whoever delivers the feedback, and yeah, and then to follow through. And it's almost like they've said, you need to do A, B, C, and D, and you kind of do all those things and keep them posted and without being annoying. But yeah, so it is, there's no, I never felt any kind of negative issues around being a reapplicant.
Well, it's interesting. The schools that do choose to give reapplicant feedback are really providing coaching. And
Yeah.
once you coach someone, it's hard not to feel a little invested
Right.
in their following what you suggest and doing well. So it's just interesting to me to hear you describe what I see as two sides of a relationship building.
Right.
They are a little more invested in you by virtue of having had this conversation and taken the time to reflect on what you had presented and what you might do differently the next time. And you end up being more invested in them. In your case, you were much more inclined to go to Wharton than to HBS because you had been growing this relationship along the way.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I get why some schools don't do the feedback. Like I understand there's even some discussion of like legally, like is there some issue with them saying to you, oh, these are the reasons we rejected you. Then you go and address those reasons, and for some reason maybe they reject you again because the pool has changed or it's more competitive. Then you get into this gray area where I think some schools are worried about that coming back to sort of haunt them, right? But in a perfect world, people would give feedback, and I think it does vary, right? There are some parts of the applicant pool where legitimately, and we used to do some feedback when I was working at Wharton because we were still doing it, and there are areas of the applicant pool that are overrepresented, right? So we always talk about white guys in finance or Indian engineers working in IT. Like there are these populations that are very well represented in the applicant pool, and where sometimes you're looking at the file and you're kind of like, what do you tell the person? They kind of did meet all the basic, marks to get in, but it was just hyper competitive within that portion of the pool. And that's hard. That's a harder conversation. So I think some schools don't really want to have that conversation.
Well, and then I'm sure, unfortunately, there's some not terribly self-aware candidates who just really didn't have a shot.
Right.
And that's got to be a kind
Those
of
are hard.
uncomfortable conversation.
Well, the other thing that always struck me was there's some candidates who take a feedback session and have no intention of reapplying, but just want to kind of get angry at the school that rejected them. So there's always a few of those each year too, where the school has to deal with this like kind of angry, like, oh, you guys, or even worse, the person got in somewhere else that they perceive to be equal or better. And so they like actually would do a feedback session just to be like, well, I'm going to Stanford anyway, kind of like this kind of like vengeance or something, I don't know. And so there are pitfalls to schools doing, the feedback. And so, yeah, I would say to candidates, like only do a feedback session if you're really genuinely thinking of reapplying. Like don't steal someone else's slot potentially just to, complain to the school that they reject you if you're going somewhere else, right? So, but I think if a school offers feedback and you don't at least attempt to have a feedback session, because some of them do have a limited number or whatever, but you need to be on record as having attempted or had a feedback session, because otherwise it's sort of like, how bad does this person want it? They didn't even bother to like get our feedback.
Right. It's your first opportunity to say, I am still really interested in you.
Right.
And you wouldn't want to pass that up if you can make it in any way you should.
Exactly.
And then to listen to that feedback, not to use the feedback section as simply a get even angry session, just take that up with your friends. And then sort of reversing through our process, getting you to that feedback session, you're going to have wanted to look hard at your own application and consider the various data points. And you want to go into the feedback session, ideally, with a sense of what they might tell you. You want to have thought this through.
Yes, that's actually a great point. So I think if you were to go into a feedback session and you have like a subpar GPA, weak quantitative stuff, or limited leadership experience, and you sound like really surprised when they tell you that, that doesn't come across well either, right? You want to be self-aware. And I remember as I heard, what my feedback was in my own session, I said, okay, yeah, I understand that, and I had thought that might be an issue, and how can I address that? And so you want to kind of I hate to say it, but like ideally you want to have already figured out like what's wrong with your file before you have the feedback session with the school, even though the school may add some additional color or points of
Right.
view. But I think you don't want to, you want to try to have figured this out. And the other thing is I think schools can only say so much. So like I doubt that there would be a school out there that would say, yeah, well, you were rejected because there were too many people that were kind of just like you in the pool. They're not going to say that. They might say, oh, test scores could be a little bit better, or gosh, your career goals, we didn't really get a good sense of short-term versus long-term, or like they'll hem and haw a little bit. So I think you want to sign up for the feedback. You want to do it so that you're on record as having done it. You want to build rapport with the person. But you also need to know that like going to an admissions consultant or a colleague who really, has been successful in this process or getting another point of view is important as well, because sometimes they can be even more honest
Right.
than the admissions team. Right?
And
So,
ideally getting that other point of view before you go
Yeah,
in for the
I
feedback
think
with the
so.
admissions team, just because it helps you present as more self-reflective, which
Right.
they're looking for.
And I would say, and there's one other piece of advice that I would want to convey in this podcast, and that is that it's hard to get rejected. And, I think we've tried to inject some optimism into this. Like, I really think, people get in at a greater rate than first timers, and there's often a lot you can do. And the application process is a little more streamlined when you're a reapplicant and you have less things to do, like visiting campuses. So we've talked about some of the positives, but one thing I would say is don't wait. I feel like sometimes people, they get rejected and they go into a bit of a funk, right? And they're really miserable and they don't kind of reemerge and kind of restart the process until it's like, August or September. And suddenly the deadlines are like a few weeks away and they throw together reapplications and they fall into the kind of pitfall of what we talked about earlier, which is like submitting another application, which is more or less the same. So any serious reapplicant needs to like dust themselves off.
Limit the wallowing.
Yeah, like wallow for a couple of weeks. And then by like May 1, you need to be back on your horse, like plotting a reapplication strategy. Which could involve, the reason I say this is because often it involves like test prep or taking a class in the evening to sort of show the school that you have quantitative ability or whatever. I mean, it could even be taking like there's that MBA math website where there are different things, HBX Core, like there are all these services out there that may be different than just a traditional course, but you need to do something and those things take time. You can't do those a couple weeks before your application's due. Similarly, like if you need to do things at work to improve or in your community, like taking on a leadership role in fundraising for an event or like you need a timeline around that stuff. And so, wallow a little bit and then try to come up fighting and really put your best foot forward and have the time you need.
I think that wallowing is par for the course in this situation. I would really encourage folks who have been rejected to take full advantage of the Clear Admit online community, where you will find people who are right there with you. And there's not much that makes rejection feel better, but sharing it with others does a little bit.
Yeah, and I know we're not like big on self-promotion, but that's actually a really good point. I think, our website does offer a nice community for candidates who've been rejected. I think you can look at, Livewire, where people are sharing results. There are, the decision wire, you can see kind of outcomes and people will often, provide advice or, we've actually in the past, and we haven't, I don't have a schedule for this yet, but we often do chats around some of these topics with Clear Admit's Alex Brown. We might, do a chat at some point about being rejected and letting people kind of weigh in with questions. So we try to provide a lot of advice for folks and I would, definitely avail yourself of all that. And listening to this podcast hopefully has uplifted your spirits because I think there really is a lot to be optimistic about as a reapplicant. As long as you can identify, the whatever it is, 2, 3, 5 things that you really want to focus on to improve your candidacy and come out with a better chance the next time around.
Right. Take this as a serious second chance.
Right.
And so take the time you need to recoup your strength and courage to go out there and then do it even better than the time before. And I think that's in part why the stats reflect that reapplicants are more successful because they come at it with their A game,
Right.
enhanced by this very personalized feedback. So it is wholly possible. Go be one of the 10% of the HBS class that applied last year, and tell us about it.
And I would say, I know some of you are saying, well, my school, the one I really want to go to, doesn't provide feedback. And what I would say is, look, I had feedback from one school, and I applied it to all the schools I was, considering reapplication to. And yes, every school's a little different. They all look for slightly different things potentially. But when it comes to things like your GPA or your test scores or your leadership at work or in your community, I mean, they all want that. There's not a lot of difference there. And so, I was able to successfully apply feedback from one institution across the board and ran the table the second time round. So I think it's definitely possible to.
And if for any reason you didn't get feedback from any of your schools, that might be a time to think about a rejection review from an admissions consulting firm.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, I think we've really covered this topic. And thank you for bringing your personal experience to bear as well.
Yeah, I know we didn't normally make these things so confessional, but I think, I always feel like if you're a reapplicant, you need to hear it from someone who's like gone through it. Otherwise, it just feels, there are probably a lot of admissions consultants out there or others who will say, oh yeah, we can get you in, the next time round. So I'm telling you, I think admissions consultants can help, but I'm also telling you that I don't have a horse in this race. Like I'm not trying to get people to sign up for something with me. So I'm just telling you the truth. And I reapplied and got into some really great schools. And hopefully that gives you hope as you, kind of proceed in this reapplication process.
Absolutely. I think it will. We appreciate your honesty and also the expertise that you've gained in many facets of the reapplication process. So that's going to wrap our episode on reapplying. I think we're on episode 12 now. And I just wanted to take this moment to again invite our listeners to tell you how thrilled we are that you are many and growing, and to invite those who have enjoyed what they hear to rate us on iTunes, because that can help other people find out about the podcast. You also have an opportunity to subscribe, which we would encourage, just so you don't ever miss a session. Thanks so much. We've got some exciting shows coming up, so keep tuning in.